Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is Spencer Barber from New Mountain Investments. He's developing real estate projects in Costa Rica as an American. So in this episode, we're going to talk a lot about what it's like developing real estate in Costa Rica, and you can kind of extrapolate to Latin America at large. So with that, Spencer, how's it going, man?
Good, good. How you doing?
Doing well. You in Costa Rica now?
No, I'm in Utah right now.
You're in Utah. So you're from Utah.
Yes.
So how does a Utah man, a Utah real estate developer end up in Costa Rica? What's the story there?
Um, that's a good question. I get it a lot. It's not a simple answer, but in short, I was developing here, and numbers stopped penciling after it
Mm,
was in 2021 when I decided to make the change. Interest rates started to spike a little later, but it was obvious that the risk reward uh, wasn't where I was comfortable in Utah, and so I took a pause on developing, and and then after a project that I did here, we actually celebrated by taking a trip to Costa Rica, and while I was there, looked at some residential projects uh, and for other reasons, I was kind of interested in Latin America already, and so that just decided to keep pursuing the idea, which led me to where I'm at now. So,
hmm And I'm just curious, why does Utah not pencil anymore? I thought everybody from California and stuff left, and the real estate prices went up in Colorado and Utah and anywhere with skiing and stuff. How does it not pencil anymore?
that's a good question, and I mean, obviously, people are building here, and you can make it work. I think the major issue is just affordability. Construction pricing has went up a lot. Land prices have went up a lot. And just for example, my margins went from like, higher than 25% down to like I was pushing below 20, probably closer to 15. Um, and and it wasn't just that the margins were shrinking, but it was just the upside on uh, the risk, like or like the potential upside on the sales price. For instance, on my last project, I was trying to build entry level housing, and I originally anticipated that I'd sell them for around 500,000. By the time that I was getting into the project, after the infrastructure, I was going to sell them for closer to 6 or 650, and so my margins were actually very similar to where I started. But I just knew there was no way where people's wages were at here that they could afford anything higher than that number. And so um, you know, I it's not just about the margins, but the upside. Where um, the project I'm doing right now in Costa Rica, I'm anticipating selling those for 750, but I think the likelihood that they sell for 850 or 950 or even a million is decent. And so it's just, the risk reward is better.
hmm And so you focus on residential real estate. I've been following you on Twitter and following the process, and I really enjoy your tweets about zoning laws. And I read the one about putting in the water pipeline and stuff, and I thought that was really interesting. It's interesting to see how people deal with the local bureaucracy. Is that your first project? Are you still on project number one in Costa Rica?
Yeah, I'm on project number one, and we're just finally getting it approved. And that is the project that I put the water line in on. That'll be 42 homes, and yeah, I do residential, and that's all I've really done. I mean, I've purchased commercial, but I wouldn't feel very comfortable trying to do a project in commercial. But yeah, that's the first one. The What's ironic you know, um, is the thing that I hear a lot is people are nervous about getting a project approved there. And they hear horror stories, but that's been the best part about leaving Utah and going there is the bureaucracy is so much easier to deal with.
Really? Easier in
The
Costa Rica?
Definitely, yeah, it's been. I mean, I'll have that project approved under a year, and I did. I was fortunate in the sense that I could get public water there. If you have to go outside of public water, then that can take some time. But it's not really an issue with the internal like approval process necessarily. I mean, you could argue it is, but yeah, it's been way easier down there actually. So. And
Hmm.
another thing that I think is a big deal too is the flexibility. Like for instance, and I've looked at a lot of properties now and looked at a lot of potential projects and the flexibility in zoning, if you're willing to take the time to do the condominium process, is way better. There's no in Utah the creativity was so limited because zoning laws really put you in a very tight box. Where there, I'm looking at projects where I can be much more creative. Would It makes it a lot more fun.
Makes sense. And I guess before we get too deep in the episode, probably should have mentioned this. This episode is not sponsored. Spencer's not paying me. We don't really even have a. We haven't even talked about a commission or anything. Hopefully, you can hook me up if people mention my Latin life. But this is not a commercial. This is purely the audience gets the chance to learn about what it's like to do real estate in Latin America, in Costa Rica. I think every American or Canadian that's taken a flight down to Latin America has been like, wow, there's actually a lot of opportunity. You can come in, maybe swoop up deals, or there's opportunity in the market for something that's missing. So I'm sure everyone's kind of had these thoughts go through their head, and I'm just going to try to do my best to ask questions to scratch that itch for people.
No, for sure. And I think that's a big thing is, there's a entry point that people can make. And you know, in Utah it got so competitive too. Like if I could just get my hands on a property, that was a big deal. Where there's plenty of land and plenty of opportunities. I will say I think there's a huge advantage if you can get into a certain price, like a certain range in terms of investment. Like me and the few guys that I'm doing this with, we're in this like, above 2 million but below 10 million range on the projects we're looking at, which allows us to outperform a lot of the projects there that people are doing that are, not done well, right? But no, I'm not competing with any big player or anything like that. Like I feel like it's kind of a sweet spot down there where you can, you know, land seller. If you go and offer a land is really illiquid, I should say, down there. Like, the
Yeah.
number in Utah, like if I buy a piece of property, I know there's a range that someone will buy it, and if I drop it 10 or 20%, someone's going to come and swoop up and get it. There, liquidity is very low, and so, there's opportunities if you're willing to buy it and take that risk. So.
Let's talk a little bit more about liquidity because I think that is an interesting thing. There's been a phrase from back in the day where it's like in Latin America, it's easy to buy but hard to sell.
That's That's true. Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I had this property under contract. It was 90 days into the due diligence. I just dropped out of it, and I would have loved to hold on to it and get the entitlement work done on it. But the real reason I dropped out was just because I just feel like I had too much going on. But but ultimately, I knew I couldn't resell that, even after the entitlements were done for sure. Like, I mean, if I got it done right, it's possible someone would have came and swooped in and grabbed it. But I knew in that particular area there might have been like three or four builders that really had any level of interest on that project, and that the risk was a little bit too much to buy it and just hold it. Now what I'll say on that same topic is I actually think finished projects are liquid though. Like, if you can get all the way to the end and do a product right, the product's moving from what I can see just fine. But yeah, like assets that have to be sold, with a large number on it that's not finished, it's going to be illiquid, if that makes sense.
Hey guys, quick break from the podcast to tell you about job stacking. If you're a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then Rolf Haltza, author of Job Stacking, guarantees you'll be able to double your income by implementing his paycheck multiplication layering method. This is the exact system Rolf has used to take his own income and those of many others beyond $20K a month. With this method, Rolf contractually guarantees that you'll be able to double your income in 45 days. So, if you're interested in unleashing your earning potential and doubling your income, then click the link in the description and book a call with Rolf right now. Mm-hmm. And I guess to visualize this particular property that you're working on, to help people visualize it, so it's kind of in the mountains of Costa Rica. I read it's kind of 1 hour from San Jose, 1 hour from the beach, kind of square in the middle, I guess you would say. And it's a lot where you intend on putting some 42 odd houses there.
So the 42 homes is actually in Guanacaste within walking distance to the beach. So
Mm.
the one that I kept, it's um, just under 500 meters to the beach. The reason I chose a property was because in Costa Rica, you can't own beach land in Costa Rica, and there's actually like a certain distance from the coast that you have to be a certain distance from the coast in order to actually hold title to your land. And I
Okay.
know that that's
Yeah,
a
there's
big
something
sticking
like that in
point.
Mexico. How much is it? What's the distance in Costa Rica?
I think it varies based on where you're at, but I want to say it's 200 meters.
Okay, that's not bad. In Mexico, it's 50 kilometers. So,
Oh wow, yeah, okay. And the thing is in Costa Rica they're pretty flexible as long as you give access to the beach. Like so, it's funny. Developers still get kind of hoggish and try to like create an environment where you can't get to their beach access and create a private beach, and that's where they get into legal troubles. But for me, I know that one of people's first questions, can I hold title? And so I didn't want to get into a project where they couldn't hold title. So I was looking for something where I could get to the beach, be within an hour of Liberia, and still hold title. So
okay, so the one I read about that was near Grecia,
mhm.
you're not doing that one. You're only doing
That's
the
the one that
one
I just dropped out of.
dropped
Yeah,
out of. Okay, so you're doing the
yeah,
one near the beach in Guanacaste.
yeah. And that's the one that I did the water line on, that store.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's pretty humid there, pretty tropical.
Yeah, I mean, uh, yeah, I don't know how that compares to other Latin American countries. I will say in Guanacaste, when you're right on the coast, I mean, there it gets hot for sure. As opposed to Grecia, where if I were going to live in Costa Rica permanently, I'd choose to go up in the mountains where it's a lot cooler for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So you've been down to the site, like surveying and whatever, and there's like monkeys in the forest swinging around.
Yeah, yeah, I've seen monkeys on our property multiple times. Yeah, yeah.
And it looks like it's kind of like a private community. It's got the gate. It's gonna have some big gate thing. You got the doorman there probably.
Yeah, and what a common so when you're doing a project and you're going to subdivide in Costa Rica, you have a few different routes you can go, and the zoning laws limit you to be able to subdivide lots based on your proximity to a public road, and um, and if you want to go beyond the limitations, then you have to do a condominium. And there's certain rules around that condominium, and the typical standard practice is you do that like a private entrance, and then you're required to maintain all of the infrastructure um, with that project. So it's almost you have to have an HOA, and you handle those items, as opposed to, in Utah. I had one project where I did that in Utah, but the other three were where, I put the public infrastructure in, and then the city maintains that public infrastructure. So now that's a process that takes some time in Costa Rica. It takes a year, but if you're willing to do that, then I could go much smaller on my lots. So, those lots, I could have went smaller if I wanted to. I ended up going 1,000 meters, square meters. But the reason I was able to go that small was because I went through that process.
Okay, cool. And what's the name of the community?
Black Coast Estates, what we went with, and it's right on Playa Negra's beach, and so that's the reasoning.
Playa Negra. I've been to Playa del Coco. I'm not sure how far that is. It was a long time ago, though. Looking
It's
it up.
just south of Tamarindo.
Hmm. Cool. Well, the beach looks like it's not black sand. Looks pretty white sandish, so
Right.
that's good.
Yeah, I and they've got a lot that, there's spots where they've got a lot of, I mean, I guess it'd be coral, or, black coral that kind of mixes in. But yeah, I think it's the name is doesn't represent it. But
Yeah, it looks cool. So, do you have a mentor in all this? Do you have a real estate mentor, either a local Costa Rican or like an American guy who's kind of like a tycoon
definitely,
down there,
I'm
or because you can't do this all like by yourself, first project, no help type of thing?
so I mean, at home. So my dad was, he started in business, and then as I got into high school, he started buying rental properties.
Mhm.
Then when I started my career, he was doing like apartments, and then we did a development together. I worked under him, and he did his first residential development. So that's how I learned it, was under my dad, and we learned it together. I mean, there's some pretty funny stories in that. We had no idea how zoning worked or anything like that. But he was my mentor, still is my mentor. Um, in terms of learning down there, I really have pretty much just learned it on the fly, like just I knew enough about development that by asking a million questions to a million people, I was able to navigate it. And obviously, uh, I'm like still in the kitchen per se. I mean, the final product's not done, so we'll see. We'll see if
All
it turns out.
right.
Maybe I've got
But
some glaring issue I don't see, but.
developing in the U.S. versus developing in Costa Rica, we have something called the Latin hammer. Have you heard of this concept?
No.
So the Latin hammer is basically a hilarious LATAM inconvenience that would never really happen in the US or Canada, right? Like not in necessarily in a real estate context, but it might be like you show up to the Airbnb and there's no hot water and they forgot to
Yeah.
turn the boiler on, or like, it could be like any random thing, right? You show up to Airbnb and there's a construction project next door and like the jackhammer and all that. But I'm sure in a real estate context, you've probably encountered a few Latin hammers.
Definitely. I would say actually the hardest thing so far by a mile has been getting money into the country. Like, just like moving money around is really hard. And what's weird is when I get to like a breaking point, I mean, I'm ashamed to say it, but like I've lost my temper a few times on the phone with someone I'm trying to coordinate moving money through, and then suddenly when I get mad, it's like, okay, we can move the money. Like, well, wasn't there a process I was supposed to move through? So if I yell at somebody, then I can move the money. But if I anyway, so that's been kind of interesting. Um, but I would say another thing that's been really interesting is there's anytime I've had to bid something, there's at least one person trying to take advantage of me in a pretty big way. Like, here when I've gotten bids done, they've always been within, even in Utah, someone will try to, bid way high, but like within a certain margin. But there, I've just gotten outrageous bids. And I think the reason why is because it works. Like, a foreigner comes down here and like, oh, this home's on the beach and it'll be $1 million home. They'll pay something that's, double what or even more what is market rate, but they're willing to do it for, so you get some pretty crazy bids.
Tell me more about this.
So the water line's a good example, where I had bids over $100,000 and I got it done for 12,500. Um, and when I first got the bids, I thought, oh yeah, it's a public water line. It stretches, all the way down this public road. Yeah, that seems reasonable. But and then the latest ones I'm bidding my infrastructure, and my first bid came in at 3.9 million, and I had anticipated based on what I'd heard and the research I'd done that it'd come in below 2.5. And so I was pretty shocked and a little nervous because it was my first bid, and I felt like I felt pretty comfortable with the people who bid the project for me. And so, I just got more bids, and it eventually came in line with what I expected. But those guys, I guess, thought that they could charge me over a million more, and it was fine. I don't know.
Hmm. And so, how do you recognize that, and how do you deal with it?
So far, well, what I'd say is I have a pretty good feel for what things should be, like, by looking at what people are selling things for, what land's going for, um, based on conversations I have with builders, I get a pretty good sense or a feel for what numbers should be at. And then, um, from there, if someone's way out of line, then, I just try to talk to more people and see if there's more bids. I mean, that's that's how I've done it, and it's worked. But uh, One thing that's clear in Costa Rica is that the job market is way softer than here, and so people are way hungrier for work. So if you find somebody who you know wants a job, then you'll get a fair price, and that's what I've seen. And now, the people who are in that position are oftentimes less experienced, and so you have to be careful there, of course. But so far, I've seen that if you talk to enough people, you'll get to the right price.
Hmm. And where are we, by the way, in the process? Like, did you break ground yet? You put the road down, sort of like foundations of the houses.
I've all I've done is cleared the land. So I've gotten like 85% through the approval process.
Okay.
So I'll be breaking ground. I mean, I could technically, if I want to go outside of permitting, probably start moving dirt now and be okay because I've gotten through the process far enough that I'm confident that my road's not going to get moved, and the lot lines are going to stay where they're at. But I'm in no rush, so I'll just make sure all my T's are crossed, my I's are dotted. I've been recommended by people just start moving, but I don't want to. But No, I haven't actually started the improvement process yet.
Hey guys, quick break from the episode to tell you about BitRefill. BitRefill allows you to shop online and in person without banks, converting your crypto directly into merchant balance. We're talking gift cards to Nike, Amazon, Apple, Airbnb, Hotels.com, and many more, all paid for with crypto. BitRefill offers more than 10,000 gift card options in 180 countries all across Latin America, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, El Salvador, and many more. You can also apply the code MyLatinLife at checkout to get 10% back on your first purchase. Go to bitrefill.com for more information.
Tell me about clearing the land. Was that a thing? Was it like straight jungle?
So clearing trees, it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of jungle, and I'm trying to preserve as much of the like existing trees as possible. And so I've been very careful about what I've cut down and what I haven't. But it's actually a pretty crazy process. And this is actually a good example. I don't know what other Latin American countries are like, but I actually think Costa Rica has been pretty organized in the sense that so I've had to mark every single tree on the property. So I have over 600 trees, and we went out there with paint. I mean, I didn't, but each tree was marked with paint to show, and the diameter of the tree was measured, because certain, and then the type of tree was marked. So if it was a guanacaste tree or another tree, it was marked on what type of tree it was, because certain trees are illegal to cut down at all. So even if it was right in the middle of my road, I couldn't cut that tree down. I'd have to move around the tree in some form. And then there's other trees that are, the length to get the approval to cut down is different. Um, but I've had to get basically each tree permitted individually to get cut down. And so I can cut down a certain amount of trees a year on the property without a replanting plan. But then if I cut down beyond those trees, then I have to have a plan to replant trees. So, which I actually think is really cool. So I've had to fill out certain forms and whatever to just um, ensure that certain trees will be replanted, essentially.
Mm.
But it was very unique. But I just think it's cool how Costa Rica protects the nature,
Mm.
and but at the same time doesn't restrict. Like, it didn't slow me down at all, if that makes sense. Like when I heard
Mm.
about that, it made me nervous. I'm like, man, this is going to take forever. And they were very quick to get through the approval. So even though they're protecting the nature, it didn't stop me or slow me down.
Mm.
So.
Makes sense. And kind of continuing my thought about mentors, I mean, who's explaining you what the regulations are? Because I assume they're only in Spanish. Are you just chat GPTing it or something, copy paste, or do you have someone that's explaining to you what's what, or how's that work?
So I've got a guy who is doing the approval process for me, and there's multiple companies that I've met now that can do this same process for anyone. So if anyone's interested in going down there, really you just need to hire the right company. This I hired an individual to do it for me, and so I've got a guy who has approved multiple properties before that I've hired on contract to do it for me. So I talk with him at least once a week, just see where we're at in the process, and he helps me understand, what the next step is or anything like that. And it's funny because I've been in Utah. I was the person who did that, and I just did that on every project, and I planned on doing it there. And on this property, when I was trying to get the water approved, they were trying to get me to take it from Honkiel down south, and they were asking for me to run a 1 mile long water line, which I thought was ridiculous. And so I actually flew out to meet with the ASADA, is what it's called, to talk about my water options. And it was kind of funny because I expected to have like a municipality building, some sort of like city building, and I just walked to what it's almost like a hut, not a hut, but like just like a kind of a little shack. I go in there and it's just the humblest meeting. Like there's there's all these people there that are in charge of the water, and uh but it became clear to me I don't speak Spanish, and none of them spoke English. And I was sat in the meeting with the translator, but I was just like, what am I doing here? Like this I need someone to represent me. And so at that moment, that's when I brought in, his name's Alejandro, who I have working with me on this. I brought him in to basically replace me.
Shout out Alejandro. And so, what would his like job title be? Like, if someone wanted to hire a fixer guy, like what are they? What is it?
Um, that's a good question. I know the most reputable company in the country on this particular thing. Their name is it's DEC, but it's DEHC. And they've done most of the big developments that are like like for instance like Four Seasons and Papagayo. But they've done a bunch, but they're I mean it's a combination of civil engineers and architects who manage the approval process. Um,
Okay, so it's really like an engineering firm representing you, sort of.
yeah, and Alejandro's a civil engineer. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I actually worked with Deck on that project that you're talking about that I dropped out of, and they were excellent. So if anyone is looking to do something in Costa Rica, I'd recommend going through Deck personally.
There you go, some insider intel for people. Another thread I wanted to come back to was the idea of getting money into the country, and you said that that was one of the more difficult parts. Could you expand on that a little bit? I find that extremely interesting.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm like somewhat in the dark why it is this way. The conclusion I've come to is actually the US government that's making it hard on me, not Costa Rica government. But you know, first off, I had an intermediary bank anytime I'd wire money over, and so I've actually got I went with Revolut now, and I've got an account there, so I can send money to Revolut and then send money in, so I don't have to go through that because I got money stuck a couple times, like in between. Um, but they just put really strict limitations. Well, one, they have to trace everything. So like it's not as simple as just saying like, okay, this money's in my account, I'm going to send it over. And I just got a bunch of different accounts and they're coming from different places. And so like to trace everything back when you're trying to send four or $500,000 at a time is a huge headache. So they're always tracing and then you have to prove it. So that's one thing. But the bigger issue is that they constantly limit how much I can send without an invoice. And it's like, I'm spending right now, I'm spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, you know, a month most of the time. And so to be stuck, like, but lots of the transactions are small. So, and I'm not getting, I mean, it might be my a, apartment for an employee's rent or something like that. Like, and so it's just a huge headache to constantly be sending like little amounts of money down. And then every time it's sent, I have to get questions from the bank, and it's probably a big part of just me being disorganized, to be honest. Like as I'm explaining it, like, oh, they have to source my funds. Like maybe that's not as big. Maybe it's just a big deal because I'm really disorganized. But it's a headache.
No, it's interesting because, at a high level, I'm interested in structure. So I wanted to talk a bit about how the structure looks as a developer or an American real estate investor. Is it like, do you have a US LLC and then a Costa Rican entity as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, and this is I know I've probably done this wrong because I've been told that an LLC I shouldn't have done it this way because this way the way I did in the US, and so I'm probably going to change my LLC to something else. Uh, but right now what I have is I have an LLC, and then that LLC owns a trying to remember the name of the entity there. They have
Like an
two.
SA?
No. What is it called? Anyway, my entity there. So my US entity where my investors are at owns 100% of this entity that owns the property. And it's a Costa Rican entity.
Hmm. And because I see a lot of opportunity in real estate, locally where I'm at, in Mexico, or really all around Latin America when I travel. And I'm like, and I've talked to a bunch of people, Americans and Latinos, about how I should do this. And I'm like, do I make a US LLC and then have that own the Latin entity, or should I just only have a Latin entity? It's like very confusing. And people said, if you introduce a US LLC into it, like the reporting and stuff is going to be like a huge headache. So I never really got a
Yeah.
clear answer.
Well, and I don't know if Mexico has a tax treaty with the U.S. I'd assume so, but like Costa Rica doesn't, which makes things a lot harder. And so, and I'm speaking out. I'm 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 not the attorney setting this up, so this is how I understand
Yeah,
it.
it's not legal
But
advice. Just kind of
yeah,
we're just
but from what
chatting as bros.
the biggest so in Costa Rica they don't really have capital gains. It's just going to be corporate tax. So I have a 30% corporate tax that I'm taxed on everything, and then they have their VAT tax. That's essentially a sales tax. So those are the two taxes I'm dealing with. But then I have another tax. I'm getting essentially double taxed by the U.S. unless I do like a pass through. So like and I don't really understand what the pastor is doing. I mean, that's what they call it, and it's checking a certain box on the form that I when I file my taxes. But if I understand correctly, it creates a situation where the U.S. investors are creating more of a loan than an actual equity investment um, for the project, and so on the U.S. side, they treat it as a loan, and somehow that allows me to not get double taxed. But that issue is specific to Costa Rica because they don't have a tax treaty. Mexico might not have that issue. Um, and the U.S., like the more I've learned about taxes, and I know very little about the taxes in terms of doing international investing, but from what I understand is the U.S. is a pain in the sense that they're, like the U.S. is the only country that if you go and are residing somewhere else, that they'll still tax you.
Hmm.
And the so like, and if per se, like my corporate tax is 30% in Costa Rica, but if I were doing the same project in Florida, my federal tax would have been 40%. Then the U.S. will still take that extra 10% in the end, um, but won't necessarily give me a credit on the other way around. So it's not very advantageous. And Costa Rica in general isn't a very tax. It's not a tax haven by any means. Like if someone's looking at like, oh, I want to go somewhere where I can avoid taxes. Costa Rica is not the place.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe at the personal tax residency level because they have no tax on foreign income. But when you're doing business in the country locally, different story.
True, that's true. Yeah.
This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Job Stacking. Introducing Rolf Haltza's Paycheck Multiplication Layering Method, a revolutionary approach that redefines the traditional career path. This is Rolf's new Done With You program where he'll work with you to implement job stacking for yourself. With this method, Rolf contractually guarantees that you'll be able to double your income in 45 days. So, are you ready to step out of the shadows of job insecurity and step into a world of career abundance? Then just click the link in the description of this episode, book a call with Rolf, and start walking the path of unleashing your earning potential with job stacking.
I think it's interesting. And so the Costa Rica has been chill about accepting tons of money. It's more the US that's what, like they're like pausing your Swift transfers, I guess.
Yeah, I don't see. I thought it was Costa Rica at first because my Costa Rican bank was the one that was constantly pressing me. But what like led me to thinking that it was the U.S. side was when I got um, this Revolut bank account that was, supposed to be outside the US, and they were still pinging me constantly on sending money there. I'm like, oh, okay, so is it just the US doesn't like the money leaving and they have requirements to make
Mm.
sure that they're checking boxes with the US side? And like I said, I don't understand it and I haven't done the research to understand it. All I know is that if I'm sending money to my Lafice account in Costa Rica, Lafice has to constantly bombard me before I can get it there. And now on my Revolut account, it's the same thing.
Let's talk a little bit about costs. I think this is like a interesting thing. I only know it at sort of the home maintenance level where, getting a toilet fixed in the US, the plumber comes by, that's going to be a $350 bill for like nothing, right? Whereas in Latin America, you might only pay, I don't know, 25 bucks for that plumber to come by. Like the cost of labor is so much lower. It's crazy. Costa Rica, kind of interesting situation. I read on your blog post that you're seeing a lot of people from other parts of Central America, like Nicaraguans and stuff, that work in Costa Rica. So hopefully that helps bring the labor costs down there. But I'm sure you've noticed a huge difference just in terms of the cost of things, US versus Costa Rica. Maybe some things are more expensive than Costa Rica. I'd imagine other things are cheaper.
Definitely. Yeah. I would say like um if you're going to Costa Rica to live and you're not going to get like just like a regular like you're not doing business, you're not going to get a huge savings by going to Costa Rica because um anything that's done inside Costa Rica is significantly cheaper. If the labor is Costa Rican labor and it's inside Costa Rica, it's cheaper. But then, of course, anything you're importing is just way more expensive. So if you're
Mhm.
just going to spend 70 to $100,000 a year and you want to live a cheaper life, I don't really see how you're doing that Costa Rica necessarily. I mean, I'm sure you can, like if you're willing to live a more Tico style life, but there's huge savings in terms of business because yeah, anything that's tied to labor is way cheaper. And then also the quality, in my opinion, is much better. Like, for instance, like you say, it's like $350 to fix your toilet in the US. That's true. But the thing is too, is they're going to show up, they're going to have a bad attitude. They might not show up when you call them, uh, as opposed to in Costa Rica, you're going to have like people, you know, you're going to have tons of people wanting to fix your toilet. And so from the perspective of someone who's hiring people like that constantly, it's so refreshing, you know? So yeah,
Hmm.
it's not, but
And that might be counterintuitive. Some people might think, oh, the Americans show up on time, Protestant work ethic or something, but it's lazy Latinos, but it's often the opposite.
definitely. And I think it's so funny when people say that, because I've had to do the same thing where I had that same perception going in, that was how it was going to be. And I mean, by no means is it like, Costa Ricans are timely per se. That's not how I would say it. But what I would say is that they're happy to have the work, and that they have a good attitude about it.
Hmm.
Um, and and I would say that they're, in a lot of ways, they are more timely in the sense that they want the job, so they're not gonna, if you give them the job, they're not gonna drop out of it, from what I've seen.
I felt like you had another thought on this. I like this topic. Let's keep going.
On the
On like
price
cost
difference.
differences, yeah, like cost of labor.
Yeah, like what I was gonna say is, I just think that, you know I just hear a lot of people want to go, they're going there to get a better life, right? They're like, I'm going to move to Costa Rica because I want a better life. And a lot of times they tie that to, oh, I'm going to save money. I'm going to down there with 100K a year with my remote job, and I'm going to live like a king. And I just think that's somewhat of a misunderstanding, because there's going to be, certain things that are a lot more difficult, um, and certain things that are going to be a lot more expensive. But what I would say is, if you're going to go and spend $200,000 a year or $250,000 a year, then your life will be significantly better, because you can hire the cook, you can hire the cleaner, you can get way more land, you can have a better house. Your the location you can choose to live in terms of, the different options is better. So, it, you have to get to a certain, level of spending until you see a lot of the benefits. And even
Yeah.
with those benefits, you're still going to have the crappy roads. You're still going to have, you're going to have to live a slower lifestyle.
Yeah, worth noting, for those that don't know, Costa Rica is by far the most expensive country in Latin America in terms of cost of living.
Right,
Like if you went next door to Nicaragua, it would be less than half of the price for everything.
right, for sure. And I think it's funny because I have like two sides of each customer that I'm talking to. It seems like, where, one side is, they're like, oh, Costa Rican, just why don't you go to Puerto Rico? Where then I got the safety of the states or whatever in their mind, right? Um, and then you have the other side that's like, well, Costa Rica is essentially just another state. I don't want to go to Costa Rica. So for me, I think it's a pretty good in between, where,
Hmm.
you're, for somebody who's hesitant about the idea of leaving the states. I mean, obviously, um, the people you're talking to most of the time, that's not the issue, right? But
We have a lot of families that want to move to Costa Rica. I'm actually actively working with a few right now, and Costa Rica is their number one choice. And it really checks a lot of the boxes. I wanted to keep asking about this cost thing a little bit. So you're probably like right in the middle of procurement. So you're probably looking at buying, I don't even know, man, like like bricks, copper, different metals, glass. Isn't glass like insanely expensive in the U.S.? How's that stuff kind of compare in Costa Rica?
yeah, no, everything's way cheaper. All your building materials are significantly cheaper as long as they're produced there.
Uh
And
huh.
so that's the key. And you'll see it in the way that they build. like if you go to even like a really nice home, you can see that they're doing anything they can to avoid anything that they have to import. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like construction costs, so the Central Valley is much different than Guanacaste. It's for everyone that I've talked to, as I gather the information, it's I'm assuming 25% cheaper. Um, and so you're at $1,000 per square meter on the coast in Guanacaste is what I would say before your contractor. So just like your cost to get the home built, as opposed to the Central Valley, I think you're probably closer to 850, maybe even 800. Um, but yeah, I mean, in terms of comparing to Utah where I was at, I'm trying to think of the exchange rate in my head, but in Utah I was at 150 to 200, and at 150, if you're going to get it down that low, I wouldn't say you're cutting corners, but you're not building a great product.
Hmm. And just so I understand what this metric is, this is like the raw material costs or
That's the total cost.
total
So for the
costs?
home, yeah,
Okay.
for the home, yeah. So it's like $100 a square foot down there to build a home.
Okay. So it's like
But
half
that's a
price to build
concrete
a home.
home. Yeah, that's what I'd say. Yeah. Hmm.
It's totally different, right? Because Utah, it's like wood frame houses, right? And then in Costa Rica, it's mostly cement houses.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're using the CMU, the cinder blocks, and they're
Hmm.
putting the rebar in there, and then they're pointing that way. I actually, if I would have done the bigger development, I really wanted to move towards ICF because I think it's just a better product and it makes sense there where they're already building with concrete. The ICF doesn't really work in the States as well. Not that it doesn't work, but financially it doesn't work because you're having to pay so much more. It like worked for a minute when lumber went crazy in the pandemic, but down there where you're already using concrete, I think it's a no-brainer change. I mean, I can see why people don't do it because I'm not going to do it on this project because I'm just too small and I've got to get the manufacturing down there in order to do it. But when I was planning on doing like 500 homes on that other one, I thought, okay, well, I'll bring in a machine myself and manufacture it because it makes sense.
And what's
And
ICF?
it's the like the styrofoam blocks, and so you stack up like Legos, and then you pour the cement
Uh-huh.
in the middle. And the
Uh-huh.
benefit is you get your insulation at the same time, and then the labor. So the people who are actually building the homes, the labor is much less intense because they're not carrying the heavy blocks, and then you're also just pouring all at once as opposed to pouring multiple times. So so you just bring in a truck, and so the pouring's easier too. But that
What
that was
about
kind of
like the construction methods? I'm sure are different. I mean, it's kind of an extension of what we're talking about where, I guess you haven't kind of got started, but maybe this is kind of, we'll have to do a round two and ask you about this, but they're probably going to be doing methods that you've never seen before. And you're going to be like, why the hell are you doing it that way kind of thing?
yeah, for sure. And like talking to a lot of people who have done both, right? Like built in the States and went there and then are building. There's a lot of things um, that I would say annoy them. I'm like even in Utah, I wasn't as heavily involved in the actual like building process. I mean, I was, but I always had a general, and so like little things didn't bother me which way or whatever, right? And so I highly doubt that anything's going to bother me there. But it is what I think is probably like the biggest difference is here we have like I don't even know the number of different subs I have in Utah, but it's a lot, right? Every single time there's a different thing done, I'm bringing in a different sub. And so like a lot of the project coordination was about okay, this guy's going to be here this day. My HVAC guy's going to be here, and I don't want my plumber on top of my HVAC guy, and so like I want to make sure that they're all lined up the right way. And then when my HVAC guy calls me and is like, oh, I'm a day late, then I have to kind of like move it all around. That's what you're doing here. Where there, it seems like the large majority is done by one crew, and they actually get the crew to live on site. So you build temporary housing on site, you move your crew on site, and they do. the large majority of the construction work. So that would be the biggest difference, I think.
That's epic.
This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you in part by Bit Refill. Bit Refill is the best way to spend your crypto in Latin America. Purchase gift cards or mobile refills from more than 3,500 brands in 186 countries instantly, safely, and privately. Visit bitrefill.com for more information.
They're just hanging out, drinking Coca-Cola, living on site. You must find that funny.
I yeah, I mean, I think, in some ways, I think it's a little sad. Like I mean, these sometimes there's families that go and live on site, and the housing is like uh, suboptimal. So it's kind of interesting. I thought so. One of the people who's bidding the project right now is actually said that he would live on site with his daughter, and he had just gotten done with a pretty good project. And I know how much I'm paying him, it's a lot if he does the project, and and so it's shocking to me that he's willing to go live on site, um, which just kind of goes back to what I've been saying. Like, here we're just spoiled. Like, the contractors are constantly annoyed if I do one small thing wrong. They've lots of them have a chip on their shoulder. Um, I mean, this guy's literally saying he's going to go and live in temporary housing on site. And by the time he's done with my project, he'd be a millionaire. He might already be one. I don't know, based on some of the projects I've seen him do. So it's like that's a little shocking to me. Anyway, it's just interesting.
No, I think anyone listening to this finds this fascinating. I think part of it also is this is probably like a sub benefit, but is to protect against the stealing of materials, right? When you're like, you're gonna have all this stuff on site. And I mean, that could happen in the States too. I'm sure there's lots of like
It
construction
does,
site
yeah.
theft in the US, maybe a little less so in Utah compared to, I don't know, New Jersey or something. But um, I think that's one benefit of having the crew on site is they can kind of protect the property.
Definitely. And one issue too there is squatting laws are way favorable for the squatter. So like
Mm,
if someone wanted to go walk on my property right now and sit on it, then it could end up holding me back and I'd have issues. So
mm.
I actually have someone on the property already, like near the property, making sure that that issue doesn't occur. But yeah, but that goes back another thing to labor, right? Like, because labor is a lot cheaper, it's so much easier just to have someone basically full time watching a property, as opposed to, here I couldn't just pay someone full time to make sure no one sits on my property.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely some of the differences there. Well, we're kind of going to get to wrapping up. Hopefully, you enjoyed the bouncing around of this. Is there anything you think we didn't touch upon, like an idea that you were going to jump on, or something you wanted
Um,
to mention?
yeah, well, what I would say, like, one of the big things that drives me down there, or like that gets me excited about being there, and I kind of touched on the fact that I can be creative with the zoning. But another thing too is that a big passion of mine is building affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, what I just mean is like a young family who wants to get into a decent home can do it, right?
Mhm.
And and that's becoming less and less attainable here. And so I was excited when I saw that I could go and build homes that people could more easily afford there. And my first project that I ended up choosing is not really geared towards that, but my end goal is really to try to find ways to build homes that attract people from the States, or foreign people that are looking for a better life, and I can build it in an affordable way down there. And and I think that is what attracts some of the upside too. Um, is your $50,000 more to someone coming from America is not nearly as big of a deal, right? And so, like, if I can build to an American standard there, then I think that I'll get my margins. My margins will be a lot better, and so that's from the business side. I think that's a big benefit. Um, and like, to just expand on that, like on the property that I was looking at before, a typical home in that area that I was looking at might sell for 250 to 350. But they have to, the standard of the home and the development is slightly less than what someone from the States would be looking for. but with maybe $20,000 more of cost per home, you can elevate that standard much higher to where someone from the States would be interested in it. But I think that they'll pay $75,000 to $100,000 more for the home. So that I think that opportunity is there, and I'm sure in a lot of Latin America countries that opportunity is there, and probably a bigger way. I think as people get more comfortable leaving to Latin America, I think that's what'll happen, is that people will create environments where people from the States are excited to move there, and I think the opportunity is huge. I mean, at some point the market will balance itself out, and it won't be as easy. But right now, it's obviously a big opportunity.
Really cool. Really cool. Very exciting things. And what do you think the future is for your firm, for new mountain investments? How do you see yourself splitting your time between Utah and Costa Rica in the future?
I mean, I'm just taking it a day at a time. Like if things change in Utah and I see that there's opportunity there, then I would love to jump on it because I love Utah. I mean, I'm a sixth generation Utahn. I'd love to go back to my hometown and build more homes for the people I know and love. Um, but I don't see that happening in the near future. So my current plan is to really solely focus on Costa Rica specifically. I don't want to relearn everything again in a new country. I mean, I'm not saying I'm not open to it eventually, but right now I see plenty of opportunity in Costa Rica. And for me, like, I really believe that I'm really big on Ray Dalio's long-term debt cycle and the rising and falling of countries, and I'm one of these
Hmm.
people that believe that that we're going through one of those times. And what I believe is that small, well-run countries are going to win in this next cycle. And
Hmm.
so, for someone who's young and looking to try to position themselves well for the future, I think getting your foot into somewhere where a country that's a little bit more nimble and has a desire to attract, the brightest in the world and the hardest working, um, uh, that they'll take the steps that are necessary to do that. And um, and so I think trying to target one of these countries that seem to be doing well, um, and finding one that has a risk profile that you're happy with is a good idea. Because
Yeah,
I do think if things go the wrong way, I hope they don't. But if they do, I think you're going to benefit being in one of these countries.
definitely. Very astute answer. Well, that's all the time we have for today, Spencer. But I really appreciate you giving us kind of the behind the scenes glimpse. It was really fascinating, and I can tell you're a really genuine guy. I really think you're a straight shooter, and really like how you approach things. So we'll be linking your website and your Twitter in the show notes, and people will be able to get in touch with you there. And
Perfect.
yeah, any last words?
No, that's great. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'd be happy to get back on anytime. So, thanks.
Perfect. So our guest again today was Spencer Barber. On Twitter, you can find him at Spencer T. Barber. And this has been another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Thanks, everyone, for listening.